and transcribe. Thanks, Devin. Okay, let me pull up the list of names again. All right, Abe.
Hi, this is Abe Abdallah from Oregon Public Utility Commission. Sorry, I was late. Having a lot of problems with my connecting to the server today, but I'm online now.
No problem. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Lori. Lori Black.
Good morning. I'm Lori Blattner from Cascade, Director of Regulatory Affairs. Nice to have everybody here today.
Thanks, Lori. Bruce Folsom.
Good morning, Bruce Folsom, IRP consultant for Cascade.
Thanks, Bruce. Kathleen.
Hey there, Kathleen Campbell. I'm a senior engineer with Engineering Services.
Thanks, Kathleen. Kevin Connell.
Good morning, everybody. Kevin Connell, Director of Gas Supply for Cascade.
Thanks, Kevin. Monica Kalishaw.
Good morning, Monica Kalishaw, Cascade's Energy Efficiency Department Manager.
Kent.
Good morning, Kent Kraus, Manager of Industrial Services, Renewable Natural Gas and Hydrogen Programs.
Okay. Brian Covington.
I'm with Industrial Services.
Thanks, Brian. Byron Harmon.
Hello, I'm with the UTC, Regulatory Analyst.
Thanks, Byron. Hai Xiao.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hai Xiao Huang, economist with Northwest Natural.
Thank you. Abby.
Good morning. This is Abby Krebsbach. I'm the Environmental Director for Cascade Natural Gas.
Thanks, Abby. Chanda.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Chanda Merrick, Director of Business Development and Energy Services for Cascade.
Thanks, Chanda. Devin.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Devin McGreal, Senior Resource Planning Economist with Cascade.
Mike Parvinen.
Yeah, Mike Parvinen, Regulatory Affairs with Cascade. Good morning, everyone.
Mike. Kayla.
Yeah, good morning. Economic Analyst with Cascade's Energy Efficiency Department.
Thank you. Chris Robbins.
Good morning. It's Chris Robbins with the Gas Supply and Gas Control Groups at Cascade.
Mark.
I guess that's me. Good morning. Mark Sellers-Vaughn, Manager Supply Resource Planning with Cascade.
Thanks, Mark. Carolyn.
Good morning. I'm Carolyn Stone, Gas Supply Analyst with Cascade Natural Gas.
John.
This is John Storvik, Energy Efficiency Analyst with Cascade Natural Gas.
Thanks, John. And Eric Wood.
Yeah, good morning, Eric Wood, Gas Supply at Cascade.
And is there anyone else who joined as I was going through the list?
Yes, this is Pam Archer with Cascade Regulatory.
Thanks. Good morning, Pam. All right. So we'll move on to just a brief safety moment. We want to make sure that everyone prevents eye strain when they're working on their computers. I know a lot of us are sitting on our computers for 8-9 hours a day. So we want to make sure that we're taking care of our eyes. Make sure you keep your screen at arm's length. Don't forget to blink. Take a break every 20 minutes by looking away at something at least 20 feet away for at least 20 seconds. So you can just think of it as the 20-20-20 rule. Be mindful of lighting and glare. Make sure your screen isn't too bright. Adjust your computer monitors properly. And then make sure you increase your computer size. And then there's a few links here on this, on this page. You can go in and follow those links and you can get some more information on preventing eye strain, but please take care of your eyes. They're very important, obviously, to your body and to your work. So I just want to touch on the stakeholder engagement. We try and touch on this every IRP. We have a stakeholder engagement document out on our IRP website. This is in order to help provide commitments that Cascade is committed to the IRP process and what our expectations are from stakeholders. So I just wanted to touch on a few of our principles here on the left. A quality stakeholder engagement process is an iterative activity that requires collaboration and commitment. It requires input from diverse perspectives. So I really enjoy hearing from all different perspectives during these TAG meetings. We try to remove all barriers to participation and communication in clear language with solid data. That is very critical to us. And then we want to be transparent and available. We'll if you guys want to meet before or after TAG meetings, feel free to reach out. We can meet. We can set up hour-long discussions and walk through models. So please just reach out and let us know. If you're not getting what you need from these TAG meetings, please reach out. And we also want to make sure it's clear that anyone can join the IRP process. So we tried to define what a stakeholder is out on our IRP website. A stakeholder is a customer or the general public participating in the IRP process. It also includes the professional analytical staff of the State Utility Commission and groups representing residential and industrial customers. And then further, community-based organizations and independent experts attending the series of meetings. So these meetings are recorded and they're posted out on our website. So if you go out to our website, you can find the recording for the first 3 TAG meetings. If there's anyone that's not part of the TAG meeting and they are watching these recordings, please feel free to reach out to us. You can join the stakeholder IRP process. So with that said, I'm going to open it up to Abby to discuss our IRP carbon update and assumptions.
Thanks, Brian. Do you have control of the slides, Brian? Okay, great.
I do.
Right. And that's okay. I'll just ask you to advance. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to run through the topics covered here, our commitment to reducing emissions, talk about our emissions a little bit in preparation for teeing up some discussion on the greenhouse gas policies. Going to spend probably a predominant amount of time on the Climate Commitment Act and how we're seeing ways to comply with that act. I'll pass it off to Brian to talk a little bit about the local focus. I'll come back talking about what we're looking at nationally, and then talk about some of the differences we're seeing between the Washington and Oregon compliance requirements for the CCA and the CPP, just notable things. And then talk a little bit about our compliance plan going forward. I'll update us on the upstream and methane emissions factor we're using in the avoided cost calculation as well. And a brief slide on next steps and conclusion going forward. Go ahead, Brian. I'll start off on talking about our emissions reductions and our emissions. So we're committed to reducing emissions at Cascade as an energy provider, proudly serving Washington and Oregon. We have an important role to play in securing our low carbon future for the Pacific Northwest. Natural gas remains the cleanest option to meeting the region's peak energy demand. This means keeping Cascade's system reliable and affordable for customers while helping communities meet their greenhouse gas reduction goals. Communities and some of these agency programs that focus on emissions reductions in the Cascade area include Bellingham, Bend, Whatcom County, Washington Climate Commitment Act, and Oregon Climate Protection Program. So those 2 programs I mentioned at the end are main things we're looking at, but there are other programs and agency requirements that intersect with those as well. Our company environmental policy is laid out here. We operate efficiently to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Our goals are comprised of minimizing waste and maximizing our resources, being a good steward of the environment while providing high quality and reasonably priced products and services. And then we pledge to comply with or surpass all applicable environmental laws, requirements, and regulations. You can go to the next slide. I think we're talking about our customer missions in this next slide. I'd actually like you to focus on the future years for a second. So anything 2023 and after, those are the emissions that we are projecting will be regulated for Cascade under the Climate Commitment Act. The yellow, they're broken out here into blue residential, orange commercial, gray is that core industrial, and then we have the non-core or transport that's right on top in yellow. So wanted to emphasize that. That's about 2 million metric tons of equivalent emissions in 2023 to start out. These are from combustion emissions from customers or from the resultant delivery of gas and resultant combustion of that delivered gas to a transport customer. If you look back in the past, this is more representative of the emissions of all gas that we deliver to core and non-core customers. And that has risen over the time, and it has its ups and downs a little bit, depending on the year, if we have new customers coming on, or a predominantly cold year where more gas is needed for heating and comfort. So if you look at the bracket there, I wanted to emphasize that those, the emissions resulting from the delivery of those therms, those are responsible to other covered entities within the Climate Commitment Act, as those entities themselves are regulated under the Act as greater than 25,000 ton emitters. So just wanted to emphasize here that as we go forward, that 2 million ton projection in 2023 is where we think we would start for entry into the Climate Commitment Act for compliance. The rule's not final yet. That won't be final until November 1st, approximately, but I believe Ecology, the Department of Ecology is on track for releasing that rule then. And just to note here, we say these are projected baseline emissions. I think what we're really saying there is these are the emissions from a base case scenario. I'll talk a little bit about how Ecology developed the baseline for the Climate Commitment Act. So just, there's some differences in how we use that terminology from the resource planning team to the actual Ecology's use of baseline. If you can go on to the next slide. So reducing those customer emissions, we have energy efficiency, conservation, demand side management programs, and we have renewable natural gas. The box over to the right shows Washington and Oregon for comparison, but these are the therm savings we've had in the last few years, and then their equivalent metric ton CO2e reductions that are associated with those therm savings. So we have seen a large jump from 2020 to 2021 as we've had increasing focus on energy efficiency and benchmarking, looking at that House Bill 2057 program efforts, and then also commercial program adaptation to meet increased goals. I am going to say Monica Kolishaw and her team is going to talk about these efforts more later on in the presentation. I just wanted to relate here that these, we have 4,000-ish in the past per year savings in tons of emissions, and working up towards 7,000 tons, 6,500 to 7,000 tons per year starting 2021. And we'll have to see how that goes going forward as we implement more. Smaller amounts in Oregon, but lower customer base there too. Renewable natural gas, we have been engaged in a lot of discussions with developers on several projects. And we expect from some of those projects that we could see some RNG coming onto our system being delivered for customer benefit by about mid to late 2024. And again, they're subject matter experts on the Teams meeting here that we'll be talking about that later in the conversation. I'll go to the next slide. And we should be talking about operations emissions in this next slide. I haven't seen it advance yet though, Brian.
Did it advance yet?
No, not for me.
Not for me either.
There we go. Okay. So our emissions from our natural gas, I went back to the energy efficiency slide. There we go. Okay. Cascade, this encompasses from our operations, our methane emissions that we might see from leakage or fugitive emissions from pipeline infrastructure, as well as combustion equipment above a certain size. So we are required to report our operations emissions to ecology. That it really, for the most part, ecology incorporates by reference EPA requirements. And in those emissions protocols and requirements, we emit about 24 to 25,000 metric tons per year. And these emissions are included in the Washington Climate Commitment Act for us, as we were over the 25,000 ton threshold in one of those baseline years from 2015 to 2019. EPA has recently announced amendments to their reporting rule. It's called Subpart W reporting for oil and gas infrastructure and segments. They're proposing emission factor updates, and they are proposing reporting of these other large release events, which are defined as events that are greater than 250 metric tons of CO2e in one event, or equivalent to approximately 500,000 cubic feet of pipeline quality natural gas. So those, if those are finalized in the rule by the end of the year, we'll start seeing the requirement to report those additional emissions and applying those new emission factors. If you look at, I was able to look at the data we submitted to UTC from our leak emissions in 2021 that I think had been in place since the House Bill 2057 requirements. I think that was the bill where those came into effect. The releases we had in 2021 that were above that 250 metric ton per event threshold would have equaled about 1,600 metric tons of emissions. So those would be added to that 25,000 tons in future. We anticipate ecology would adjust its baseline accordingly if more emissions are included. A lot of discussion with Department of Ecology as this rule is finalized and if we are required to comply with these emissions as well. And depending on what other operational emissions you'd include, because depending on the protocol requirements, you might not be getting everything. And when we tried to do a little bit more robust inventory of our system, there are probably some additional emissions. So, and depending on the emission factor and protocols you use, we really estimate that you could see in the range of 35,000 to 48,000 metric tons of CO2e from our system. We're refining those numbers. I'll talk about that a little bit on the slide next, but just to give you an idea of what that range is for Washington. And when you compare it to our customer emissions of like 2 million metric tons, there's a remarkable difference there. And our emissions rate for our local distribution system is in the range of 0.06% or 0.1. that's a percent volume of methane emitted per total methane throughput volume to our customers. It really depends on the type of protocol you're using, whether it's strictly the EPA sources that you include, or if you include everything, and then the different emission factors that are applied in those different protocols. If you look at one future is a group of companies that have gotten together in the natural gas supply chain. So in different segments of the supply chain, you could have LDC members, transmission, gas gathering, production, all across the supply chain. You have members of that group. We're not a member, but we do engage with some of those members, and they are members of AGA and NWGA as well. So when you look at the goals of that group for LDC emissions reductions and emission rate goals, they have targeted a 0.22% rate for LDCs. We're below that, which is great. And their companies in 2019, their data reflected their LDCs in that group achieved a 0.092% rate. So we're really right in there. And when you look at the protocol that they use and the range I have, I think we would actually be in the lower range for Washington in comparison with what they're achieving there. So more in the range of like 0.06 or 0.7 when I'm looking at our different protocols. So that's really good. We're right in there and doing well and making reductions. So if you could go to the next slide. And this slide is meant to focus on what we're doing to even further reduce our operational emissions. We've talked about this in the past. We've committed to methane emissions reductions through the Natural Gas Star Methane Challenge Program. We started as a founding member in March 2016 and focused predominantly on those excavation damages, as we saw that as the potential for being the higher level of emissions within our system. So we created our compliance coordinator, our public awareness coordinator, implemented our damage prevention program. They report on trends and other information and progress to the commission and other venues. We're actively participating in 811, Common Ground Alliance, and other local underground utility coordinating councils. And we analyze excavation damage data and report that data to EPA then. And it's all in combination with what we're looking at through our damage prevention program group. I don't have any trends to present at this meeting, but they do present to the UTC periodically. We have created a more robust inventory of greenhouse gas emissions in all operational areas. And especially for 2022, we're going to be releasing a more robust inventory that we'll be providing in our sustainability report. Some of the other drivers of that are the SEC rulemakings that are going to be final by the end of the year. But we had already committed to doing this before that. Really digging in and identifying where the emissions are coming from that helps us prioritize where to focus our efforts on reducing emissions next.
Could I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
So is there kind of a macro level way that you guys can see like a discrepancy between where these leaks and emissions are happening, say like volumes that you guys are purchasing and then how much is delivered, and then there being some unaccounted difference, and then kind of seeking out that loss? Or are you guys just kind of adding up this inventory of smaller events? Like how does that kind of work? How do you guys know where to look for things that you don't know about? Like known unknowns, I guess.
Yeah, so we're trying to take more of the approach of using what we know about each individual instance to get a more accurate look at that. Because when you look at, I don't know if I could speak specifically to each type of operation, how we could look at throughput through different devices. That's something we are looking at. Like we're using what we already collect now if possible, to identify if we're seeing things happening at meter regulator stations that we're missing. We're actually looking at doing more leak detection using like leak monitoring devices periodically, with a consultant possibly to go out and look at, do we have leaks occurring when maintenance is going on versus just normal operation? Those kinds of understanding. So that we can identify how often we would do maintenance on a station, and then you can take the maintenance time times what we see from a leak observation, and you can at least quantify that and go, okay, is that large or not? Those are things we're currently exploring and doing. Otherwise, again, it's like this, you can look at a throughput, but it doesn't help you focus on the specific area unless you dig down. And then if you're using just default emission factors, like for instance, what EPA uses, you might not ever show or demonstrate that you're reducing anything because those emission factors are by mile of pipe and or by just a volume of throughput based on some very high level emission factor that doesn't even represent your system. So we're trying to dig in further to make it more company specific. I'm hoping that answered your question, Byron.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
So an example is where we're internally reporting gas losses to the level of much smaller non-hazardous releases. And it involves a number of different departments to capture that data. And sometimes engineering services needs to step in and help do the calculations depending on the volume of loss and the pressure and and some of those factors. So it's been set up and we're capturing that data now for those. And across our whole entire company, not just Cascade, we're doing it in all of our states, 8 states. So we mitigate methane leaks and have adopted a program to quickly address even small leaks that are not considered a public safety concern. We're exploring ways to reduce emissions in normal operations, including the use of methane capture technology for pipeline blowdowns. We are exploring a pilot that we would do in the near future with, I know there are a couple different technologies out there, but one I'm aware of that we've been looking at is like a ZVAC unit. I think there are GoVac. There are a number of different vendors who do this, but instead of taking a pipeline out of service and letting the pipeline blow to empty out the gas, you would actually capture that gas and re-inject it into your system. That's just an example, so that you're reducing those emissions. Okay, I can go to the next slide. And then we have our system integrity projects where we're replacing older vintage pipe with newer vintage, lower tendency to emit materials. As of 2012, we've estimated that we've replaced about 98 miles of vintage steel with new steel or polyethylene pipe, less emitting, and over 45 miles in Oregon. So over 98 in Cascade and over 45 miles in Oregon, and we have more projects in future replacements. We're better positioned than most utilities where they might not have protected steel pipeline, or they might still have cast iron that is known to be more leak prone. So we have a more modern system, which is great. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. So getting into the Climate Commitment Act. That program, I'm sure you've all read a certain amount of it anyway. It's a cap and invest program establishing a declining cap on greenhouse gas emissions from covered entities. Talk a little bit about that. And those limits, those reductions are consistent with the limits that were established in statute. The act includes a program to track and verify and enforce compliance with the cap through use of compliance instruments. We'll talk about what those are and how we intend to look at those compliance instruments. So the reductions that are in statute are to achieve 1990 levels by 2020, 45% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030, 70% below 1990 by 2040, and 95% below 1990 levels by 2050. Covered entities include fuel suppliers, natural gas distribution, electric utilities, and large industrial facilities or manufacturing facilities. Landfills and certain emissions intensive and trade exposed entities are added into the program as we approach the second and third compliance periods. But we start as natural gas distribution at the outset in 2023. You can go on to the next slide, Brian. So our regulated emissions are our customer emissions, including all core, like I mentioned before, and then our non-core that are entities that aren't emitting 25,000 tons themselves, or that may opt into the program on their own, or they could possibly petition to be emissions intensive and trade exposed entities. We're not exactly sure of the likelihood of any of our large customers, like transport customers that just are still our responsibility at this time, whether or not they would explore those other areas. And that's something that we're planning to reach out to them to understand what they might be considering. And so those emissions, again, are in that 2 million metric ton range. Then also our operations emissions are included, like I mentioned, 24 to 25,000 metric tons from methane leakage and fuel combustion. We have one compressor station in Washington that is a combustion source that we report.
Could I ask a question about that big bullet point in the center there? Are there any entities, or like how many customers don't fit into any of those categories? So I guess another way if I'm asking it is, if you have all of these kind of like emissions that are covered by the CCA, are there any entities that just kind of like fall through the cracks, if you will? Or does the combination of what Cascade has to do, plus the people who particularly are individually captured by it, cover everything?
From my read of the rule and how we're working with ecology to report emissions for customers, even in the reports that we've submitted to them, we report emissions. We're actually required to report emissions for customers that emit, it's about 183,000 equivalent use of MCF use of natural gas, or 10,000 ton emitters. We're actually required by rule to report what we deliver to those customers. So they're kind of using that possibly in a way to just kind of catch anybody who might not to understand where they fit in the program, I would say. And so I think I'm not in the only ones who I think might be outside, and I know from an exemption perspective, national security facilities under certain NAICS code or NAICS code are not, subject. And we have a number of naval facilities that we supply gas to, and we've taken those out of our expectations of emissions obligation and have, let's see, thinking there could be, I'm totally speculating here, where you have entities who are large manufacturing facilities that aren't connected to an LDC and get direct supply from a transmission pipeline that fall under the 25,000 category. I don't know, there could be possibly, but they're not our customers. So I don't see any of our customers, whether they're covered themselves or under our obligation, how they would not be in the program. So was there anything else there that kind of caught your eye, or as I was saying that?
Not quite, no. You did a really good job answering that. The CCA is still very new territory to us. Like in the UTC, we don't get that much communication with ecology. So I appreciate that
Okay.
clarification.
Yeah. Great. You can go to the next slide, Brian. Just giving a little bit more detail on the baseline. So ecology's term of baseline is where they're establishing that cap to begin with. And so they're looking at our emissions from those core and non-core customers that were our obligation, and our operational emissions of what we've averaged in 2015 to 2019. That's our 2023. Well, that's our baseline. And then when you get into what our estimated no cost allowance allocations would be for natural gas suppliers, because we are allowed no cost allowances in the rule, ecology takes and gives it just like a 7% haircut off that baseline average amount. So in the graph to the right here, I show it starts out in 2023 at 93% of baseline. We've estimated that with the knowledge we have and the emissions that we've reported to ecology at this point, that will probably be in the realm of like 1.6 billion no cost allowances, as our baseline was in the range of like 1.7 something billion metric tons averaged over that period. And keep in mind that that baseline, we had 1.7 million metric tons ish. In 2023, we are estimated to have about 2 million. So we're already above what our baseline would have been. And then we have, we get a reduction at the get-go here for 2023 for allocation of allowances. Then that reduces from 2023 or to 2030 at 7% incremental from that baseline emissions value. So we see that kind of steeper decline in the near term. We've provided comment to ecology that it would be better to have even in the first compliance period, that first 4-year period, to have a little bit less reduction as that program starts and we get our feet under ourselves and the costs start coming in of buying those allowances and other compliance instruments and options. And we'll see if what happens with that, the comments we've submitted on that. But from 2030 until 2040, you have a 1.8% incremental reduction from baseline. And what those do at those points in 2030 and 2040 and 2050, where you have that 22.6% reduction from 2040, on an annual basis, so the baseline from 2040 to 2050, it is meant to, I think, align with the statute, and that you're getting that 45% reduction by 2030 from 1990 levels, and then the 70% of 1990 levels by 2040, and then 95%. It kind of aligns with that. I've done a little math on that. It kind of, but it's meant to, I think, try to mimic that. And then I don't have that here on this slide, but for those no cost allowances, we will need to consign some. And in the first period, the first 2023 to 2030 period, those will decline. And by 2030, it will be 100% consignment. We start out at 65% of those allowances. 65% of what we receive as no cost allowances in 2023, we would consign and generate revenue, and then work with the UTC to determine how best to utilize that revenue to benefit customers, whether it's crediting customers, such as we're required to offset the cost of implementation of the Climate Commitment Act for low-income customers, so that revenue will be used in that way. But would you then be able to use that revenue to credit customers, buy more allowances, or implement more decarbonization options for the natural gas system, RNG, other things. So there's a lot of discussion that we'll be having with the UTC as time goes on of how we would use those revenues. 65% consigned in 23, excuse me, increasing 5% each year to 2030, where again, it's 100% consignment of no cost allowances there on forward. We would receive our no cost allowances starting in 2023. And the first year we're proposed to be allocated those allowances by September 1st. That may pose some cash flow challenges that we'll need to work with the UTC on, as auctions will start occurring before that time as proposed by Ecology. So we would potentially be engaged in auction purchases of allowances before we would get any no cost allowances allocated to us. 2024 and thereafter, we would have allocations of no cost allowances in October of the prior year. So you have them kind of ready to go. And then those are consigned at pretty much the first auction, I think, is how Ecology has that set up. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. Again, I think I mentioned this, that we start compliance in January 1st of 2023. Rules final by about November 1st of this year. 4-year compliance periods. And we have to demonstrate compliance by November 1st of the year following the end of each 4-year compliance period. However, there are still interim compliance period demonstrations. So by November 1st, every year, that would start in 2024 would be our first annual compliance period for 2023 emissions. So by that November 1st annual date, we would have to have complied with 30% of our prior year's emissions. And again, quarterly auctions would commence in 2023. And the next slide I show is kind of my my notes on how this might work. And so it's, you know, it's to be determined, but this was what I could glean based on what was in the rule and what Ecology has been posting on their website for, they've been posting more information on how auctions would work and some timelines. I'll just go through this quickly. So if you look at the bottom, there's that light gray box that says Ecology notices auction. So Ecology has said that we'll have quarterly auctions starting in 2023. The rule says Ecology has to notice each auction 60 days in advance. So my projection is if it's quarterly and you want it in the quarter, you might have an auction by March 15th. You go back 60 days, it's January 15th. So it's a ballpark. We just don't know exactly until the rule's final. But once that auction is noticed, we have to determine if we're going to participate in the auction to begin with, and then update any registrations that we would have already submitted to Ecology for setting up our holding accounts, our compliance accounts, and our limited use accounts. There's 3 accounts that we would have. So we would update that registration. We'd submit a registration 30 days prior to auction. Just a lot of things happening in this 60-day period. If we're using any consultants, they have to make disclosures of who they're assisting in the auction. There'd be a big guarantee that would be due 12 days before the auction, and Ecology would then need to also send approval of your bid based on what you bid and whether your bid satisfies this maximum bid value requirement. And we have to make sure that we're not trying to purchase allowances beyond a holding or purchase limit. And then payments would be issued 7 days after the auction would occur, or within 7 days of Ecology's notice that, hey, you were awarded the bids and we need your payment. So every quarter that would be occurring annually from here on forth, starting in 2023. Ecology will also, if you look at the way bottom, 45 days after each auction, Ecology provides a summary of the auction results. They maintain confidentiality. They don't release like who purchased X amount of allowances. I don't think. It's more like how many allowances how the market was operating. Then again, this is a uniqueness to 2023. On the top part of the line, Ecology distributes 2023 no cost allowances. So it's nice visual to see that we have maybe 3 auctions already occurring before we would get our no cost allowances. So we need to work that out with the UTC to determine how cash flows flow for customer bills and what happens when those revenues do start coming in, because you'll have the no cost allowances in that 4th auction probably consigned. And then we won't have a compliance deadline that first year. Again, that's 2024. But we will have our next year's no cost allowances allocated to us by October 24, 2020. And then we will also have new announcements from Ecology by the first business day of December of the allowance prices. And those allowance prices would be for our general or floor allowance, ceiling price units, and then the allowance price containment reserve allowance tier 1 and tier 2 prices. I allude a little bit to that allowance price containment reserve at the bottom. And we don't know when those auctions would be held. It just really depends on how the auction prices, how the settlement floor prices turn out. And I feel like I could talk for days on this, but we need to move on. And I'm gonna check something here for time. Oh, jeez. Okay, so the compliance options we have are renewable natural gas. It's a 1-for-1 replacement of fossil gas. The carbon intensity is not included as a consideration. It's just 1-for-1 replacement of the energy used for fossil gas. We can bid on allowances. We can also have there are price ceiling units that if you could not demonstrate compliance at the end of a compliance period and you bid on allowances, you purchased offsets and you bought renewable natural gas, you had a high heating year, you need price ceiling allowances or units, you can request Ecology to issue you price ceiling units, and those are at just a much higher cost. Offsets, again, they're limited to 8% of a compliance obligation in the first compliance period and then 6% thereafter. Energy efficiency and conservation demand side management. We can conserve therms and reduce our emissions, and then hydrogen as a future option. And you can go to the next slide. Our RNG limits in our modeling right now are based on what we believe our company's potential share would be based on an AGF ICF study that was released in 2019. And that study provides RNG potential out to 2040 by different types of RNG and then adoption curves for the various types. And then those are used to generate our acquisition curves for each type. For hydrogen acquisition, we're starting that a little bit later. And as that technology would expect to be developed further out. And according to the Gas Technology Institute, when you look at the safety of the blend of hydrogen in our system, they say about 20% or less hydrogen is introduced into the system. That would reduce overall risk. It would be not as significant for both our mains and service lines. And there's more studies going on right now to try to confirm those numbers. So we'll be monitoring and paying attention to those. What we've converted is we're looking at this as more of an energy replacement. So when we look at the volume, hydrogen burns at a lower heating value and different densities. So all modeling is done in therms. And we convert that 20% to an equivalent 7.4% of what we would see as replacement in our system. We use the 7.4% limit as what energy would be provided for blending hydrogen. If you have any other questions on this, I would pass them over to Devin. If not, I'm going to go on to the next slide. This is just a projection of what that might look like, where we would start off in 2025 with, we do have hydrogen in those years, but in the modeling itself that we're doing, we're pushing that out into future years. But we would have a lot of RNG coming online, both Oregon and Washington compliance.
Could we go back one slide? So where you guys talk about minor increases in safety risk, how much bigger of a safety risk are we talking about? And what sort of like data exists to kind of like wrap our heads around that increased risk?
I can try to talk a little bit about this, and then Abby, if you want to chime in also. It's a great question. I actually attended a kind of seminar a couple of years ago, not a couple of years, a couple of months ago, sorry, with a couple of other regional LDCs. Northwest Natural is doing kind of intensive studies on this as well, specifically with one of their own facilities in terms of the blending of hydrogen. FortisBC has done this as well. The short answer to what you're saying is everybody's going to have to figure that out for themselves. So we are really hesitant to kind of try to comment on what we think the degree of risk would be until we did some internal testing ourselves. So we're going to be watching a lot of what some of these other companies are doing. But in terms of quantitating that specific risk, I don't think it's something that we would want to comment too far on. As you can see, that was quoted. No, that was not quoted directly, but that came from that GTI study. And that was kind of their findings on it in a laboratory setting. We really would want to do some of our own internal analysis on what ends up being some of those risk factors when we do increase beyond that 20% blend. So I'm sorry, that's a little bit of a vague answer, but really at the end of the day, we're kind of outlining this, and a lot of this technology is still on a somewhat theoretical level for us. But we'd want to wait until we kind of had some actual testing done before we would comment on what some of those risk factors might be.
Okay. Is it your guys' intention to inform consumers or customers about those risks when you come to know about them?
That's a good question. That will involve some discussion with engineering, depending on what we see. So when we look at this low amount of blending in the system, some of the things that I understand are issues are, hydrogen, the molecule and constituent itself compared to methane, it has a potential to for some additional leakage. So it's implementing certain monitoring on your system could be needed to ensure we're just monitoring that, ensuring that that's not occurring versus how we monitor for leakage for methane right now. So it's knowing where those points would be where we'd have to focus on monitoring. That is a focus of some of these studies. Where is it that you might see? It's not like the whole system. It's certain parts of the system possibly. And then it's like, well, if it's a certain part of your system, maybe you would just need to replace a certain component or two. I'm guessing about this, about how that's going to come out. But Devin's right. It's like there are more that's going on. Even out east, there are pilots. There's one in Minnesota here right next to us in North Dakota. CenterPoint Energy is doing, where they're blending hydrogen and looking at these. I know Lori Blattner is going to talk about hydrogen as well here as we go. So just giving you an idea at this, when you look at the smaller amount of blending, it's a smaller risk because it's not, you want to make sure it's not collecting all in one spot. So then it looks at, well, how do you monitor hydrogen in your system? And that just needs to be looked at. So when you start adding it, you're implementing the right procedures to ensure that it's maintaining in a blended form within the system.
Okay,
And
so I
that's
think
our
I might, yeah, I think I kind of like made some assumptions when I read that. I thought that we might be talking about safety risks on, say, the consumer end, and you guys are talking more about like transportation and like mixture ends and on your end.
Yes, and
Okay.
from the customer end, it becomes more of a performance. So if you don't have the right quantity of energy for in the appliance, and I might be speaking out of turn here, there's a certain amount of, if you're replacing 100%, you might be looking at a, you know, a hydrogen specific appliance. Okay, sorry about that. But with these smaller blends, this is thought to be a level at which it wouldn't cause those customer equipment performance concerns. Those are still questions though, and they're being looked at. So we're trying to, this is what we're using right now, and it could be fine-tuned to something different in future.
Thanks. I appreciate
Abby,
that clarification.
Oh, sorry, Abby, I'll touch on this a little bit too, when we talk about hydrogen a little bit later.
Great.
Yeah, and I got something too real quick. It'd be like your integrity risk, you know, the different vintages, types of pipes out there and how they interact with the hydrogen. Something else that is probably generally covered under that safety risk.
Great, thanks. I'm going to pass it off to Brian. He's going to go through these local slides. And there's a hand up though, Brian.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, JP.
Just to follow, hey, thanks for all the discussion on hydrogen. This is interesting. Just one question: are there, because we're thinking about this, but other stuff going on with you guys, is there stuff that needs to be done on to the pipes that are going in now to allow for a safe level of hydrogen to get to 20%? So beyond, not going above and beyond what is known to be safe in terms of the absolute mixture, but in terms of like current pipes to just get up to that, are there things that need to be?
That's a great question. And we've posed that internally to our engineering group to think about, because if there is something, yeah, we need to start evaluating that now. But I don't know if Kathleen can comment on, you know, when you look at protected steel and polyethylene pipe installations, those seem to, it seemed when I asked the engineering group, it was a lot of what we're currently putting in is consistent or synergistic with that smaller assumption of blend. I don't know if Kathleen has any comments there.
Yeah, I agree. It's not as much concern on the more modern pipes than the newer plastics and things. It's more your vintage systems, vintage steel, how they interact is the bigger industry risk. But industry, you know, this is a new emerging topic, so everyone's looking at this. I know, like, we work with GTI and they do a lot of testing and things, and AGA too, working on a lot of those committees and things. So it's all being looked at by industry, and really you got to kind of see it long term. You know, what is 50 years of hydrogen blending? You know, it'll change over time. You know what you see.
Thanks.
Right. Yeah, thanks, JP. All right, so I'm gonna briefly touch on the local focus. We've touched on this in, I believe, all 3 tag meetings we've had so far. But since we're talking about GHG reductions, we figured we'd bring it up again and talk about it. So we have the city of Bellingham. They passed an ordinance back in February, which requires electric space and water heating equipment for new commercial and large buildings within Bellingham city limits. It also requires incremental improvement in energy efficiency and solar installation or readiness in new buildings. The electric only mandate for space and water heating does not apply to single family construction, detached houses, duplexes, townhomes, or row houses. And then we put the effective date for this ordinance. And we're running a sensitivity analysis based on this new limitation. We went back and looked at historical data the past 5 years, I think, 4 or 5 years. And we tried to determine which customers would have been impacted from this ordinance and then kind of carry that over into the forecast. Now, this is kind of just an estimate. It's very difficult to predict what customers are going to do. Maybe they go to, instead of going inside city limits, they just stay in Bellingham outside of city limits. So we may not see that actual decrement of 50 customers. They could also go to surrounding areas to Bellingham that we also serve. So we're not exactly sure what type of impact this is going to have. So we're running this as a sensitivity analysis.
Is your assumption with this analysis that it's a linear, like loss of customers, or are you assuming that there's some like non-linearity going into the future?
So we assumed a linear of 50.
Okay.
Yeah. So the city of Bellingham continues to work on the design of a climate action fund. Preliminary drafts indicate that this would be treated as a property tax and would direct funds towards electrification, among other efforts. Following the city council and mayor expressing reservations about the design and timing of the plan, it was announced that they will delay putting measures on the November ballot. Cascade's going to continue participating and monitoring what's going on in Bellingham, and we'll make sure to continue to update in the IRP process. We also have Whatcom County, which voted to ban the construction of new refineries, coal-fired power plants, and other fossil fuel-related infrastructure. This doesn't necessarily constitute as a natural gas ban, but it may have impacts on our distribution system enhancement projects in the Whatcom County area. And that one's more of a monitoring right now. City of Bend, they have some aspirational goals, and the aspirational goals is a term that they used to reduce GHG by 40% by 2030. And they're focusing on 4 main areas: energy supply, transportation, energy and buildings, as well as waste and materials. Now, when we had a Cascade representative on the Climate Action Steering Committee, there wasn't really a specific carve out. They didn't come to Cascade and say, this is what we want you guys to reduce. Cascade has committed to working on offset programs, and we have also been rewarded the Bend landfill RFP in the city of Bend, which we'll discuss a little bit later on this presentation. And the city's current Environment and Climate Committee is having preliminary discussions about the role of gaseous fuels as part of a decarbonized future. Cascade intends to share information on its emerging RNG efforts and overall renewable gas potential as appropriate. And then I'll turn it back over to Abby for the national focus, unless there's any questions. All right.
Okay, I'll run through these as quickly as I can here. Department of Energy is in the process of holding a proposed rulemaking for energy conservation standards for commercial water heating equipment. And that rulemaking may result in impacts to baseline equipment used to determine Cascade's energy efficiency portfolio. So something we'll keep monitoring and including in our analysis. The Department of Energy has also announced or launched a notice of intent for funding opportunities for clean hydrogen. Lori is going to be talking a little bit about hydrogen here, so I won't talk much, but that was associated with the bipartisan infrastructure law. Again, we're monitoring those activities and implementing them as they fit our company needs and compliance needs. And EPA recently announced, I mentioned this, that subpart W rulemaking comments are due this fall. The rule will be filed by the end of the year, we expect, and then we'll implement those emissions reporting with ecology elsewhere in our LDCs. And just to note, you know, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision on July 1st on the West Virginia versus EPA case of greenhouse gas emission regulation for coal-fired and fossil-fired electric generating units, and how EPA can regulate those emissions and their methodologies. So EPA basically was their authority was curtailed to how they've utilized and applied best systems of emission reduction processes for existing units in past rulemaking. So kind of restricted them from any kind of outside the fence. Can't require a renewable facility to be built somewhere else to replace a coal-fired unit. And all the issues that could potentially result in transmission infrastructure and grid reliability when you look at a rule in that fashion. So, but they're expected to propose a new rule early next year that would be completed in consistent with that U.S. Supreme Court decision. And it would potentially result in rulemaking for new units as well. We're kind of monitoring that too. That could result in low carbon fuel requirements for new and existing units that could impact what we deliver to those types of customers. The U.S. Senate bill actually passed the Senate this last week here. It's the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. It was reduced in late July, and it's been on a fast track here to get passed. It includes climate change investments to promote decarbonizing the economy. It has some, we're digesting this still and trying to understand all of the potential opportunities as well as any challenges this may create or impacts to our system and customers. You could incent biogas development, I think, in this rule. So we're digesting that piece. How does it affect and interrelate to the projects we're looking at developing for RNG? And then it also includes a methane emissions reduction program for fees or investments in reducing methane leaks from production and distribution of natural gas. Those fees don't directly, I don't think they directly apply to our LDC. They would apply upstream if you're a company that owns a transmission segment and you, or a production facility that when you do your emissions inventory and your throughput and your emission rate is above a certain quantity, then you would have to pay a methane emissions fee. And when those entities pay those fees, it's passed down to our customers eventually through our gas supply contracts and payments. So those would trickle down to us. We have not done an estimate of those emission or those costs, but that's something that we will include in this too, as it's potentially going to pass the House here soon. We'll see where that ends up. I'm ready to go to the next slide. Okay, just a real quick differing policy between Washington and Oregon, especially on what you can use for emissions compliance for the Washington Climate Commitment Act and the Oregon Climate Protection Program. So RNG environmental attributes themselves unbundled from the biogas itself, that's currently allowed in Oregon. And it's actually allowed in Washington, and it's allowed in other Washington state UTC RNG programs, as well as low carbon fuel standard programs across the Northwest and the coast, and through EPA programs. But Washington Climate Commitment Act, currently how we read it, we wouldn't be able to just use those attributes that you would buy off system and combine with your fossil gas, similar to how you do on the electric side with a REC that you would buy, where you couldn't say that that wind facility generated electricity that actually got to your customer. That's kind of how this works. Washington Climate Commitment Act, I have a question mark there, currently doesn't allow for that. We're hoping that when the rule is final, that that's allowed and it's consistent with all of the other different programs across the Pacific Northwest and coast, so that we can more easily, less challenging way to just differentiate what types of RNG would be used for which different programs. It gets a little complicated. But you can use biogas with associated environmental attributes. So that biogas with its combined environmental attribute, you can use that in both programs. There are no cost allowance allocations for each. However, Washington Climate Commitment Act has the auctions for additional allowance purchases that we can use for Washington, where Oregon does not have any ability to, doesn't have an auction. You basically get your no cost allowances in Oregon, and that's all you're allocated. And those decline over time. Allowance trades between entities. The allowance trades are all done on the auction platform in Washington. Oregon, you could have some trading between covered entities. I have a question mark there because we believe it's unlikely that there would be a huge market for that, as there's really limited ways in which we can comply with the rule in Oregon. So people are probably going to hang on to those allowances and use them in future, but we don't know yet. Offsets, they can be used in Washington. There are no offsets allowed to use in Oregon. Community climate investment credits, it's a special program that Oregon DEQ developed for the CPP, where you pay fees to certain qualified community climate investment entities who will take those fees and generate emissions reductions in Oregon. And DEQ there will oversee that program and will evaluate whether emissions reductions are occurring in that program, but an entity who's covered would just pay a fee and generate these credits, with one credit equaling 1 metric ton of CO2. And you're limited in how many you can buy there too. So the environmental offsets in the line above that, yeah, I talked about, there's limits to that. It's 8% for Washington and 6% in the first compliance period and 6% per year obligation ongoing. Community climate investment credits for Oregon, it's like a 10% for the first period, 15% for the second period, and then 20% ongoing. So it's kind of an opposite approach there of how they're doing it. We can use energy efficiency and conservation DSM programs for both. Hydrogen is allowed for both too over time in the future. And just wanted to comment that limiting RNG to demonstrating contractual delivery is just seen as misaligned with other states' determinations. So when you look at that Washington, we're just really hoping that Washington Department of Ecology will be aligning its RNG acceptance of book and claim concept as consistent with the other regulations in the region. And those differences can cause some compliance challenges with planning on our system, where we're trying to satisfy both the needs of the Washington and Oregon customers. You can go to the next slide. I think we're close to the upstream methane calculation here. So we have updated our upstream methane emissions calculation. The UTC had provided, the staff had provided comments to us on looking at how we were applying our US Rockies upstream emission loss factor, whether or not we should be using something higher, such as the EDF range of 2.47% emission loss per throughput for the Rockies. And then you guys also asked us to take a look at what our global warming potential should be. We were using 24 or 25, I believe, in the old calc. So we changed the methodology. We're using the same methodology, but we're changing the upstream emission loss factor for the US Rockies And we had also adjusted the global warming potential for methane in our calculation. And we increased those a little bit according to additional studies we were looking at and some review we did with a consultant to assist us in this process. So
Could I ask some questions? Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
I wanted to ask this question before we move past them. If your methane per unit of natural gas is 93.4%, what's the other 6.6%?
it could be, there is other minor constituents. You could have some ethane, butane.
Butane.
Yep, and CO2, actually, there could be a little CO2 in there. Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. And it, like, there's minuscule amounts of other constituents that might be in there. I know that like our tariff includes like you can't have any X amount of like hydrogen sulfide or SO2 in there, so.
Mhm. Are you guys including the like ethane, propane, and other things like that in your emissions?
No, we are not. And that's based on what we're directed to calculate here.
Okay.
I would have to go back to the statute language, but I believe it focuses just on methane.
Okay. And with this assumption of leakages, basically of the 1.43%, that's much higher. That's like 14 times higher than your guys' own internal estimates for your own leakages. So I understand these are for a different portion of the supply line, but is that just that the rest of the supply line is just super inefficient, or that there's a lot more leakages out there, or how do you kind of like marry that difference?
Right, so it's additive to a certain degree. So you have our segment, which we've not reconciled this. We are using the studies that have done that reconciliation of all the different segments. I'll bring that up, but this is in line. This comes from an EPA 2017 study. This 1.43% that considers all of the emissions that occur within the supply chain using, I believe, a bottom-up approach, meaning that you're capturing all the different emission sources and applying emission factors to those. Those emission factors are probably based on actual leakage measurements at one point in time, and then you have to kind of extrapolate across the whole entire industry. Again, there are a lot of assumptions that go into that.
Yeah, it just seems like there's a very big variance between, I guess, your guys' own internal kind of like investigations and findings versus this EPA.
Yeah, and it could be very unique. So if we actually looked at our own supply chain, we'd find a different number for sure. We actually submitted questions to our suppliers, including our transmission suppliers and then our marketers, to ask them if they've ever compiled any information on this themselves. And predominantly the answers were no. The closest entity was like who would have been the transmission segments, which would then only be that transmission segment where we could add ours to theirs potentially. And I can't remember if we had discrete numbers from those transmission segments. But yeah, we tried to look at that, and it's something that we'll continue to look at in future. It wasn't something we felt like we were comfortable with coming up with and using here.
Okay.
And the emission factors continue to change and be evaluated too, as EPA drives more investigation into these areas. It's still very important to try to fine tune it.
Thank you.
Okay, so we do take that 3.4% that's used, and it's when you look at the different supply we have, we assume 64.2% is supplied from Canada. We're using that 0.77% emission loss factor that was from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council study that was done in preparation for this upcoming update to the their next report. So we stayed consistent with that, but updated and increased that US Rockies. Again, that's a 35.8% estimate of what we have supplied to our customers. That results in a 167 grams of methane per MMBTU. Convert that to CO2e, applying that 28 global warming potential instead of, I think it was 25. And this is based on some of the assessment report, more recent assessment reports that have come out of the IPCC. And I think the current assessment report 6 is still in draft and could be final at some point here in the next year. We recognize that EPA hasn't changed their use of the 25 global warming potential, but we anticipate that they will be updating that in a future report. So, and it would increase a little bit. So 28 we felt was a better number to use. That results in a 4,681 gram per MMBTU, gram CO2e per MMBTU emission rate for just that upstream contribution. Then when you add that to our end use emission rate for customers emit the natural gas we supply, adding that methane leakage rate to that in CO2e, you come up with a total emission rate of 55,097. And just noting here on the bottom right, our previous 2020 IRP emission rate was about 54,000 CO2e per gram. So it increased a little bit. And if you go to the next slide, I do have just a couple more notes I can provide. Again, I mentioned we're basing that off of the EPA 2017 emission year and gas system only values. Our 1% upstream emission rate, after further evaluation, it was lower, although we thought the methodology was still appropriate. With looking at further studies, it made sense for us to bump that up some. So we looked at using in the range of those studies up there and being consistent with the Northwest Power and Conservation Council report, we determined that making it that US Rockies rate 1.43% was appropriate, and it's consistent or within the range of the metal life cycle model study. And it's 0.08% below the IEA study. I'll show a difference on the next chart, just to show where that kind of 1.43% falls in the range of some of these other studies. So a highlight of these studies was identifying the challenge of tracking methane emissions in the gas supply chain. Kind of what you were asking about there, Byron. It's challenging. And one potential option for Cascade to account for difficulties in emissions tracking, especially when you're trying to apply one number to this and not having like specific system numbers, we could look at a high case scenario and we could apply that 2.47% EDF emission rate as a high scenario for modeling purposes. Same with the, so we changed to using the methane global warming potential of 2028. I mentioned and kind of went through this on the previous slide. Those are more consistent, and we think that EPA is going to come up with some updated numbers here soon too. We kept the 93.4% methane and natural gas in line with some EPA estimates. Those were about 95 to 98%. We have looked at what our gas supply is, and the 93.4% is in line with that. We'll continue to evaluate that and adjust as needed. Next slide. And I think we're almost done after this. So we know the UTC staff was really wanting us to evaluate whether to use that 2.47% emission rate that EDF had. And we really felt that that was still an outlier for us. And we felt that we recognize the upward pressure on upstream emission rates as new evaluation methods arise. We do not believe it is appropriate, though, to move forward with the results of a single study when several other recent studies from reputable sources have not corroborated that result. You can see that in the graph below, where we're looking at this 1.43 value that's kind of dead center in the middle there. And then you have some of these other ones that are outlying and in the same range. And then you have that EDF one to the far left that's way up there. And we've increased then our value that we're using by about 0.43%. And just some notes on the EDF methodology and our concerns with that. If there was any question that UTC had on that. Current inventory methodologies for the EDF study kind of missed emissions that occurred during abnormal operation conditions. So they're actually missing some things potentially too. Could the value even be higher at some point? We'll have to just continue to monitor that and view those reputable studies that are coming out. So again, just our response here of accurately measuring methane remains challenging. And it requires more frequent, regular sampling and potentially more satellite-based methane tracking if we really, really want to get that accurate number. And then that becomes a cost question of what we're gaining for what we know from the studies at a lower cost. But we'll continue to track new methane monitoring approaches and monitoring standards as they're developed. But we'll currently defer to a stronger consensus, which is what we have displayed here, that we think supports that 1.43% choice. The other thing that's going to happen is SEC reporting, rulemaking that we think will be done by the end of the year will really, companies will have to start reporting all of these things for that. So all of the oil and gas companies will start releasing more detailed information from their systems. That might help with identifying more accurate numbers too. So we'll see how that goes going forward. If you can go to the next slide. Our next steps, a lot of compliance planning and demonstrations. We'll be working on modeling our impacts based on what we know from the Washington Climate Commitment Act, and then working with UTC and UTC staff, commissioners on how do we manage auction revenues? How do we distribute that accordingly when we get those allowance allocations? And how do we get our rate recovery mechanisms in place for all of the different cash flows that will be occurring as these auctions and other compliance requirements come about starting in 2023. We continue to pay close attention to all of the policies coming out at all different levels. And wanted to just note that we'll be providing more modeling impact results at the TAG 5. And with that, I appreciate your patience with me working through all these different slides and talking about this stuff. It's all really important. Appreciate your patience and listening.
Thanks, Abby. Do we have any questions for Abby? If there are no questions, we'll take a quick break. Trying to catch up on some time. And so we'll take a quick 7-minute break and be back at 10:40. All right. It is 10:40, so we'll get going again. We were informed that someone wasn't able to type in the chat box. So I had Devin test it, and it came through for me. So if you're unable to type in the chat box, let me know. We may have to just raise hands and ask questions over audio if the chat box isn't working. So just let me know if you try and type something in and it doesn't go through. So we're going to jump into renewable natural gas. The first thing we want to do is just give a high level introduction to what RNG is. Some people are new to the industry. If someone watches this video and they're new to the industry and want to learn a little bit about RNG, here's a little bit of an RNG 101. RNG is renewable natural gas, which is a pipeline quality natural gas produced from various biomass sources through biochemical processes, such as anaerobic digestion or gasification. And there's more information here at the U.S. Department of Energy if people want to go out and look at it. We can get this RNG from things like farms or landfills, where the CO2 and the methane is collected, is cleaned up. We make sure it's at pipeline quality before we put it into our pipelines for customer use. Some examples of RNG is biogas from landfills. So this is where we collect waste from residential, industrial, and commercial entities. And the digestion process takes place in the ground rather than in a digester. So that landfill, it takes the waste that we provide the landfill and it turns it into natural gas that we can put into our pipes. So there's biogas from livestock operations. This collects animal manure and delivers to anaerobic digesters. Biogas from wastewater treatment. This produced during digestion of solids that are removed during the wastewater treatment process. And then there's other sources, including organic waste from food manufacturers and wholesalers, supermarkets, restaurants, hospitals, and more. And again, there's more information at the U.S. Department of Energy if anyone is interested. They have a lot of presentations, videos you can watch. So a lot of good information out there. So some benefits. Go ahead, Byron.
I want to ask a question just before we move on. I don't think this is covered in later slides. Is RNG seasonally limited? So for example, like when we're talking about like meeting load and stuff during the winter, you have these peak days and stuff when it gets really cold. But I mean, my understanding of basic biology is that a lot of these biological functions tend to happen under warmer temperature conditions. So is there some kind of like seasonal availability issues that arise with RNG?
Yeah, I can take this one. So yeah, you're right. To keep the bugs happy and to keep them producing, the RNG, the breakdown of the biomass, you got to keep them at a certain temp. A lot of these RNGs, they heat the bugs up. But when it gets cold out, you're right, you can have interruptions. I know we're still assessing, reliability and it depends on each producer a little bit. We have 3 RNGs that have been online for about 2 years in Idaho. And there's kind of a process with them. So their first 2 years, they're getting their bugs all set up. So they don't yield as much. But as the processes improve and as this technology advances, potentially they could be more reliable on those cold days. But they do heat. So that would be a mitigation, would be heating the bugs to keep them happy, but it's just the performance of each producer. So
thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Kathleen. So some benefits of RNG. So fuel diversity, very important for us to have fuel diversity. We use RNG, increases and diversifies domestic energy production. RNG can be used as baseload fuel source with high availability rates. It leverages existing infrastructure such as pipelines and heavy-duty vehicles. And the biogas feedstocks or RNG are generated continuously from a variety of sources. There's also economic benefits to the local economy through the construction of RNG processing and fueling stations. Some other things to think about, like for farms and landfills, this is another option for business for them, providing RNG where potentially we could keep the cost of food down if there's farmers or food processors that are benefiting from this RNG process. So those are some of the economic benefits. Local air quality benefits, replacing traditional diesel or gasoline with RNG can significantly reduce emissions of nitrogen oxides. Obviously, RNG is comprised primarily of methane. Compared to fossil natural gas, RNG contains 0 to very low levels of constituents such as ethane, propane, butane, pentane, or other trace hydrocarbons. And then GHG reduction. So capture and recover methane produced at a landfill or anaerobic digestion facility has a global warming potential more than 25 times greater than CO2 in a relatively short atmospheric life. So reducing these emissions can achieve near-term beneficial impacts in mitigation of global climate change. So there are a lot of benefits to RNG. I didn't want to put together a cons of RNG, but one reason why natural gas facilities haven't moved towards RNG sooner is because of the high cost of it, and we want to look at the IRP as a least cost solution, but with carbon compliance, RNG is becoming more cost effective in terms of hitting our carbon compliance. So there's a lot of benefits. One downfall is the steep price, but we are working through all of that. And then we have a quick video, and I tested this morning and it wouldn't work for me. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to share. Everyone see this video?
Yes.
I'm going to take it away real quick because I need to include computer sound. Okay. It's just a quick 2 or 3 minute video.
Quebec's energy future depends on an increase in the production and use of renewable energy, like solar, wind, and hydroelectric energy, as well as renewable natural gas. Renewable because it is generated from residual organic matter, such as food and agricultural residues. Think table scraps, grass clippings, cow dung. These are all types of natural organic matter that are in endless supply and quickly renewed. And thanks to processes like biomethanation, these residues are transformed into renewable natural gas. By this process, the residual organic matter ferments in an oxygen-free medium called biodigester. Its fermentation produces gases which, purified, become renewable natural gas. This energy can then be used for cooking, heating, and transportation. Natural gas is a great way for a city, a region, a community, or business to value its residual organic matter and to produce locally an energy that is 100% from a renewable source. With renewable natural gas, imagine energy differently.
Now go back to sharing the PowerPoint presentation. If I can find it. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint presentation now?
Yes, I see it.
Thanks, Carolyn. And now I'm going to pass it over to Devin.
Thanks. Let me just try to get my camera. Perfect. Okay, I'm actually going to start with a question that Abe put into chat because I think it's a great lead in actually to what we want to talk about with this cost effectiveness evaluation. Abe asks to Brian, when you say the downside is the steep price, how does that compare to other green gas production initiatives such as green hydrogen? It's a great question. Related specifically to green hydrogen, I think one thing we've seen in a lot of our market analysis of what potentially could be the cost curves of these resources is RNG. What we are seeing from that study that Abby talked about, the AGF ICF study, is we expect the cost curve to kind of increase over time, with the rationale behind that being that the low-hanging fruit will be acquired early. Projects like the Bend landfill that was discussed before, where we really think we can kind of get it at a great price point, are going to be the ones that are snapped up early. And then as that low-hanging fruit is gobbled up by us and others, it's going to leave projects that would be more expensive to develop. So we see kind of an increasing price curve. We talked a little bit about this in our last tag meeting, how we're modeling it as 2 different tranches with even the potential for a third one in some of our sensitivity analysis that can go as high as, I think, $26 per decatherm. Green hydrogen is kind of the opposite, which is interesting. What we're seeing from some research that we've done, I think it was an S&P article where they did a little bit of research about what their projections would be for green hydrogen specifically. The philosophy, I think, behind that is more so that as the technology is currently nascent, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to develop it at a really inexpensive price point. So in the earlier years, we're seeing RNG as definitely a more cost-effective resource compared to green gas initiatives such as green hydrogen. However, as that technology continues to evolve, becomes more efficient, economies of scale start to grow on it, we see that cost actually having a declining curve. So in the beginning, RNG is definitely more cost effective, but over time, green hydrogen, we expect, especially because there is investment going into it, right? A big part of President Biden's, I think it's the Build Back Better, I forget which initiative specifically, but big part of that is billions of dollars being invested towards some of these hydrogen hubs. And that we really see is going to be the start of a lot more investment in that region, which will eventually bring down the cost of production and thus the cost of green hydrogen. So it's kind of crossing curves, which is, I think, pretty interesting. But I think that's a great question. And once again, it leads into this concept of when we evaluate RNG for cost effectiveness, on the surface, you just look at it as one resource versus another, with the other being traditional natural gas or fossil natural gas. RNG does not appear to be cost effective if you look at them just in a vacuum. We're seeing a lot of price points around the $14, $15 per decatherm range for that renewable natural gas, while traditional gas, even at the most expensive, seeing in these upcoming winter heating season, at most at Sumas, I think we're seeing like $10, $11 per decatherm, but typically it ends up falling closer to that $4 to $5 per decatherm region. But there's a number of factors that end up leveling the playing field. There is a potential hedge value of RNG, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later, about maybe how do you quantify that. But there is value, as we've talked about in our last tag meeting, in the certainty of certain resources, right? There was that value to the certainty of avoided costs. And while there is, as Byron and Kathleen talked a little bit about, there is some uncertainty about some of the reliability in cooler temperatures. For the most part, if we do have a contract for an RNG facility, we're going to have a reasonable idea that we're going to get X amount of decatherms per day. And there is value to that certainty. The biggest value, however, is the environmental attributes. As Abby talked a little bit about, we're going to have compliance obligations. And so RNG, every metric ton of CO2 emissions that are not emitted because we use renewable natural gas, essentially offsets the need potentially for buying a community climate investment, or going out to the auction and having to buy metric tons in the auction, or participating in an offset program. there's value to that. There's a quantifiable value. Even beyond that, though, if let's say we existed in a state that didn't have that, there are existing marketplaces. There are these RIN marketplaces that different types of RNG projects produce a quantified type of RIN, which I don't remember what that stands for exactly, but it's basically a unit. The environmental attribute could be sold on a third part to a third party on a marketplace, and there's value for that as well. That ends up offsetting the costs a little bit. And there also is cost savings relating to building versus buying. As once again, we talked about the fact that we are able to we were the winning bidders in building the Bend landfill out and building the RNG project facility from that is going to provide some cost savings, being that we're going to be the builder, we're going to be taking on that investment versus just buying it in a marketplace. That's another way. And while we can't get into specifics just yet on cost, it is a potential savings that we're seeing on that building versus just buying. It's a critical resource for us. RNG is going to be a vital part of our resource stack. We're going to show in a little bit later, kind of a more theoretical, it's a not finalized resource stack yet, but it's something that we did when we were doing some initial analysis related to Washington's Climate Commitment Act modeling. We did some initial analysis, and we're going to show kind of a preliminary stack of what our resource stack might look like, and you'll see RNG is a significant portion of that. And when it's not cost effective, and we're going to talk about what we mean by cost effective in the next slide, where we're going to talk a little bit about our kind of cost effectiveness model. But even when it's not cost effective, it might still be desired. There are certain regulatory exceptions, voluntary programs that I think Lori is going to talk about in a little bit. And also Oregon has SB 98, which is a program that we can choose, and I think we will eventually be choosing to opt into. It's not mandatory for us like it is for larger utilities, but it provides a mechanism where you can, as long as you don't increase revenue requirement by a certain amount, 5% is typically the baseline, but as a small utility, we do have the option to go higher or lower than that based on our specific conditions. But you do have the ability to go above to acquire what would normally be non-cost effective as long as it doesn't increase your revenue requirement by a certain percent. Once again, typically around 5%. Brian, you can go ahead to the next slide. So this is our basic cost-effective formula. What we're trying to look at when we're trying to figure out is, without any of those other regulatory mechanisms, is RNG going to be more cost-effective than conventional gas? So when we're looking at RNG, the cost of RNG, that's CRNGC, the all-inclusive annual cost, we're looking at obviously any upfront investment that we're going to have to make. But then we're going to back out some of our annualized upstream and downstream avoided costs. So those avoided distribution costs that we talked about in the last meeting, as well as avoided upstream costs. And then for each day, we're going to look at the price of it, plus any kind of variable costs to move it along our distribution system, although I guess that theoretically could be backed out because that's going to be constant. It's going to be, well, okay. So it would be constant if we were looking at an RNG program that was off our system, right? So let's say, for instance, I'm going to pick on Oregon just because it was popping to our head. Let's say we ended up picking up an RNG project close to Portland, right? We don't have any distribution systems in that area. But if we were to go ahead, similar like how we have our mist facility, we could move gas from Portland onto our system. We would have to pay a variable upstream pipeline cost for that. And so that would be captured there. However, if we were to build such as the Bend project, when we build it on system, that's a variable cost that we're not going to end up paying. So in the RNG portion, that actually ends up being a benefit where that value, that VC value, ultimately ends up being zero for a non-system project. Versus on the conventional project, we probably would still want to quantify, it would be offsetting a decatherm of gas that would need to be flowed on our pipeline. So that variable cost would apply. And then the Q is the daily quantity of gas that would be evaluated. So, oh, and I forgot also the CIF, the carbon intensity factor. For us, the long and short of it is that's meant to capture that environmental attribute. Now, when we initially did this, we were kind of looking at, we were expecting that some of the evaluation processes would look at different types of RNG and you'd want to look at the carbon intensity or how much carbon is mitigated as part of that formula. The basic way to think about that is a landfill, for instance, while the RNG that is going to be captured is going to offset some methane, it's not nearly as much as, say, a dairy, where significant amount of methane are leaked in. And so by capturing that RNG, you're going to offset more methane. Capturing that intensity factor is important in the calculation. Today, that's manifested instead in those RINs that we were talking about for the most part. When we're evaluating projects, we reach out to Shanda and Kent and our various RNG folks, and we ask them what they expect to be the RIN value for that project. And that's going to be able to let us know from a cost effectiveness evaluation perspective, what would be the value of that. And once again, dairy would have a more valuable RIN versus, say, a landfill project, presumably. And usually from whoever we're talking to on the project, the consultants can usually give us an idea of what kind of RINs we would be looking at. Then the cost of conventional, it's a lot simpler. It's basically the price of conventional gas. So we're going to look at our price forecast that we talked about in some of the previous tag meetings. We're going to add in that variable pipeline transportation cost and then multiply it by the quantity. The basic premise of it is if the cost of that conventional is greater than or equal to the cost of RNG, project can be considered cost effective, and it's definitely one that we'd want to acquire. If it's not cost effective, we still might want to acquire it. Once again, this doesn't really account for this formula in its current iteration, doesn't really account for some of those compliance costs that we talked about, right? We talked about the value of the RINs, and that is in that CIF, but what if acquiring that RNG was the difference between us actually complying with some of these state regulations that we have to acquire? Theoretically, that instead of that CIF, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, that CIF could instead be some kind of penalty cost, or even, you could even look at some of the optical costs of that, right? It doesn't look good if we're not quantifying beyond just what we would have to end up paying in fines. So that could be that cost there. That is kind of what we're talking about, is how it might still be considered cost effective. And then there's also the regulatory exceptions like we talked about, the mechanisms like that SB 98 that allow you to acquire those programs as long as it doesn't exceed the 5%, give or take.
I have a quick question about your variable cost.
Yeah.
At least and this is probably my ignorance speaking on this. I imagine variable cost being outside of the parentheses as being kind of a bundled out, one-time cost for a contract. So I imagine if you buy it and you want to get it onto your system, it's like an upfront cost. Is it measured is it a unit cost? Is that how it works within the industry, or why is that within the parenthesis there, I guess is my question.
It's a great question. It is a unit cost. So with our transportation contracts, there are two elements to those transportation contracts, and we're looking at it from, once again, an upstream transportation process, right? The process of us going to a Northwest pipe and saying, hey, we want to flow these 1,000 decatherms on your pipeline. So there's a fixed element and a variable element. The fixed element is the reservation for that contract. To flow that 1,000, we have a contract with them. One Quad 2, for instance, is our biggest contract. We're paying that no matter what we end up flowing on there. So that's not going to be considered. But there is also a variable element to it. If you have that contract and you don't utilize it, you're not paying that variable element to it. But if we do flow that 1,000 decatherms, for instance, there's a small variable rate that we do pay on each unit that flows through those pipes.
Okay, so it's a little at column A, a little bit at column B then.
Exactly. And in that variable, we're only capturing, in that VC element, we're only capturing that second part of it, right? We're leaving out that fixed cost because presumably that's not avoidable. You could get into some things, there's capacity release, but we're not going to really dig too far into that at this point. I think that's a little too far in the weeds for this calculation. But for the most part, it's that variable element, the ability to not have to flow on each given day that 1,000 decatherms or however many it might be through Northwest Pipe that we want to quantify.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. So these are some of the key inputs that we're going to want to evaluate when we're utilizing. This actually is a snapshot from our model itself. So I'm going to go over some of these that are significant and explain kind of how they operate. So the case/RIN selector, that gets into that environmental attribute. D5 is a type of RIN. We could go, there's D3 RINs, and that's something we're going to once again get from whoever it is that we're going to be presumably buying from, or any consultant if we're building. We want to get an idea of what is going to be that environmental attribute. This model was also set up to evaluate the different types of RNG. So for instance, the case selectors would also have like case 1, case 2, and case 3, which had to do with different types of carbon pricing. This was kind of a vestige from some of the older modeling that we did when initially we would look at things like the social cost of carbon as the value of mitigating 1 metric ton of CO2e. So that would be, I think, case 1, for instance, would be to value every metric ton offset at the social cost of carbon. And then that interacts more with the carbon treatment line item about midway down, where once again landfill would be one type of area, while dairy would have a much higher carbon treatment and thus benefit more, and that social cost of carbon would have a higher multiplier that would be part of the valuation process. State jurisdiction is important as well. When we're trying to figure out what that impact to revenue requirement might be, we want to look at, are we just looking at Washington? Are we just looking at Oregon? Or is this going to be a system resource? That's going to obviously have different impacts when the revenue requirement calculation, and it's obviously not a full robust revenue requirement calculation, as those of you who are in rates would know. That's a much more complex. It's supposed to just be a simplified projection of impact to revenue requirement, and there's a tab that does that in our model. The projected term of the project, obviously, and the output, the project output percentage obliged. So this is important. As we've been going through our negotiations, we've realized that for some of these projects, we might not get all of the RNG. And it might be negotiable, actually. So they may come to us and say, we will sell you 50% of the RNG at price point X, which is just $14.50 for this. But if you wanted 100%, the price point's going to go to $16, for instance. Or maybe they'll have an option to sell it to us at a certain price point, but we'll only be able to be guaranteed that 50%. So we can kind of play around with that, and we can even toggle those different inputs based on if they're telling us if it is negotiable or not. We can kind of mess around with that in some optimizer functionality to really figure out what the best mix might be for that. There's also the potential that we may not have to make all of the investment. So you see, for this theoretical project, there would be a $3 million project investment. And this is modeling saying that we pay 100% of that. Well, one thing we can evaluate is if, let's say, because we've also seen this, if we agree to pay 100% of it, they give us a lower price point. If we were to toggle that down to, say, 50%, maybe they would ask us to pay a higher price on the supply. So maybe that would go up to $15 or $16, and we can see what the interplay relationship of that would be. Talked a little bit about the type already. RIN risk rating, that gives us some optionality to play with it if there is uncertainty regarding what the RINs might be. We're actually going to talk a little bit about that. That's something we're kind of teeing up more for a future improvement as well, when we're going to potentially be looking at some stochastic inputs for some of these elements. But we're going to need to gather more data about what some of the variances might be before we could do that stochastic analysis. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Inflation escalator is also important. And a lot of these deals, we're seeing the producers come back to us and say, okay, this once again gets to that investment area. If you're willing to do the full investment, maybe we won't have any kind of escalator clause in there. However, if you're not willing to do the full investment, they're going to want some kind of protection in the form of an inflation escalator. If we would have had this conversation a year ago, I don't think everybody would have been as worried about that, with inflation being at a much different point. But now that's a significant issue. When we're having those conversations with our producers, now accounting for what that inflation escalator might be could be the difference between a significant cost impact or not. So we want to be prepared when we have those conversations. Are they expecting an inflation escalator? Is there any kind of cap that we could negotiate into that as well, to make sure that we're not fully exposed to inflation, as we're seeing it continues to be quite high. And if it were to continue to escalate, we don't want to be fully exposed to that. That's an awful lot of risk for us to take on. The non-blue boxes or non-blue line items are more results. So the potential market value, that enterprise value, that's ultimately going to be that cost effectiveness calculation that we talked about in the prior slides. So for this particular example, from a pure enterprise value, this would not be a cost-effective project. However, as we can see, we also calculate what we expect the revenue requirement increase or decrease to be. This would only increase revenue requirement by 0.51%. So we wouldn't want to look at this in a vacuum, right? We want to look at this in relation to maybe other options that we're acquiring. But if it's not going to have too significant of an impact to revenue requirements, this might still be a project we would ultimately want to consider. So we're able to use that and present that to our executives and show them all of this information to help them make those informed decisions on how do we want to negotiate and if we want to move forward with certain projects. Although, once again, similar to everything that we do with the IRP process, it's a decision-making tool. It informs, it does not decide. Those decisions are ultimately still going to be made by those subject matter experts and decision makers. We talked a little bit about this before. It's an interesting calculus when it comes to purchasing versus building. Obviously, there's a lot more risk coming on with building, but there can be some cost savings. And we actually have two slightly different models that can evaluate the difference between purchase versus building. We utilize them based on what it is that we're actually evaluating. And oftentimes that's dictated to us. A producer will come to us and say either, hey, we're giving you the option to buy it, or hey, would you like to be the builder of this project? The build model provides a more detailed breakdown of some of those items related to ownership, some of the depreciation issues, for instance, of actually owning it. It allows for some of those more in-depth calculations related to that. The purchase model, it considers revenues that we would also earn from the transportation agreements. So presumably every time that we acquire an RNG project, or we are contacted by somebody with an RNG project, in that example where we talk about the ownership percentage of, or how much of the RNG is going to be sold to us. If only 50% was sold to us, somebody's doing something else with that other 50%. And if it's on our system, presumably we would end up engaging in the transportation agreements with whoever had that additional 50%, and we would make money off of that. So we want to go ahead and make sure that we're accounting for that. In the build model, presumably we would be using 100% of the RNG for ourselves, so that's not as much of a calculus. But in the purchase model, you want to kind of see how the interrelationship plays when you're acquiring less RNG and more of it goes on just the transportation side, versus if we were to acquire all of the RNG and we wouldn't be gaining any of that transportation revenue. So the model is able to account for all of those different toggles and variables.
Going back to that, does it account for the difference of like markup and stuff like that? So for example, if you purchase it, I assume the person who's making it wants to make a profit and would mark it up, whereas you guys would not be incurring that cost if you were to build it out yourself.
Yeah, it's tough to know exactly what somebody's markup might be. Usually all of that ends up being on a purchase, just negotiated factors, right? Like we can, to some extent, there is some optimizer functionality in the purchase model that allows us to basically say our break-even number would be X dollars per decatherm. So that's something we can use in our mindset when we're going ahead and having those negotiations. But ultimately, typically that price is dictated to us. And I guess to some extent we can get an idea when you saw what that enterprise value is of what the difference might be at our break-even point versus the price that's being dictated to us. While the build model is more of a pure, just these are what you expect our costs to be, the investments we're going to have to make in cleaning materials, interconnects, maintenance, operations, staffing of that, things of that nature. And it presents those costs. That's going to be a lot more, we dictate that, but there is also uncertainty with that too, right? You never know if you engage in a project to build and you have these projections, and then 2 years out, there's always overrun, right? You know, when it comes to building projects, you can never know for certain what it's going to be. Since we're still pretty early in that, we don't have too much available towards accounting for some of that variability, but we're excited as we continue to be larger players in this market and continue to engage in more projects. We can look at what some of that variance ends up being over time and build some stochastic models to try to account for that better.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. So yeah, getting into those future considerations, I've talked a lot about most of these already, but just some kind of key touch-ons. That risk reduction value, you know, it's something that we're going to be talking about internally, but my personal opinion is that is something, now that we are seeing a positive risk reduction value in our avoided cost, I think that applies to the RNG as well. It's not going to move the needle in a huge regard. I think if you remember from our last meeting, it ranged from 0 to 25 cents per therm, I think, or maybe per decatherm. I don't recall off the top of my head, but that would obviously be a big difference. But we're not talking about $5–10 per decatherm, but there is some value to that certainty that we want to make sure we're quantifying. That stochastic analysis also, once we're able to gather more data to be able to calculate things like variances, we'll be able to do some stochastic analysis of some of these key inputs, some of those build costs, for instance, to make sure that we're accounting for some of that uncertainty properly. And we could do, let's say, a value at risk analysis when we present that to our executives, saying this is what we expect costs to be, but say maybe with 99% certainty, we think they would go no higher than X. And then also that modification of that CIF factor. I think this is something that I'm really interested in doing as well. Instead of it just being those RINs, I think what it really should end up being is that IRP marginal carbon compliance cost. So part of the IRP rules, I believe, in both states is we want to capture those marginal costs for a bunch of different factors. And carbon compliance cost is going to be a big one, right? When we complete our IRP modeling, we can identify what the next resource would be for carbon compliance costs, whether it's higher than expected RNG or energy efficiency or auction, price ceiling allowances in an auction. We can identify what that cost factor would be and use that instead of that CIF factor, because that's what it's ultimately going to end up displacing, making sure that it's done on a unit-to-unit basis, right? So if one of them is in metric tons and one of them's in decatherms, we'll make sure that it's all kind of scaled appropriately. But I think that'll be a good enhancement to the model to make sure that it's properly valuing that RNG. So I think that's all I have from this theoretical perspective. I think now we want to drill down into some more actualities with RNG. Are there any questions before I kick it over to Lori? Well, hearing none, thank you for your participation, everybody.
Sorry about that one. Yeah. Sorry. I guess I'm looking at the previous draft of your tag 4 presentation where you guys had your the graph showing the change in price versus like the number of units.
Yeah.
And you had talked about this kind of idea that basically there's this idea of like all the low-hanging fruit getting taken up first and then more and more difficult forms of extraction coming on. So is it your notion then with the graph that you guys had previously included that that was essentially frozen in time? Or do you kind of expect that to be kind of a 3-dimensional graph where you can also imagine time and seeing that curve coming down over time too?
Yeah, so that graph was more related to balancing if I remember correctly, it's the price versus quantity acquired and doing an efficiency frontier based on that. And it basically, I felt like it would be more value instead of just because we were getting short on time, kind of talking about that as we talked a little bit about when we showed the inputs. Felt like it'd be more value to talk about it there. I think the concepts you're talking about are super important, and that's thinking about it. Like you said, that graph was more on a micro scale, evaluating one specific project and what that efficiency frontier might look like, while the RNG time relationship is more of a macro scale, where we're looking at over time, how does that low-hanging fruit kind of go away? And we're definitely going to have figures in the IRP that show that. It used some of that ACF, ICF study data where they show how price is projected to increase over time because that low-hanging fruit would end up being acquired early. We'll definitely have some conversation about that in the IRP.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Byron, and thank you, everybody. Take it away, Lori.
Thank you. My first slide, I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about our voluntary RNG offset program. We touched on this a little bit before, and it's going to be an important piece of our decarbonization framework going forward. And we have been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to set everything up to allow for a successful program once it's launched, but unfortunately you can't see a lot of that. And so just an update kind of on what we've been working on. The first step has been to do some internal restructuring so that we can staff the program. And we're going to be posting within the next week for a manager position that will have responsibility for the final development and implementation of this voluntary program. And that manager will also have responsibility for oversight of our low-income weatherization programs in Washington and Oregon. So we feel like there's some synergies between those, the work in those two areas, and that will really allow us to have somebody that has dedicated focus on a successful launch for this program right from the start. And then at the same time, kind of simultaneously, we've been working on a plan to secure the resources, RNG, and/or attributes that will help support the program once we're ready to launch it. We feel like we're making progress in that regard as well. And then after we have those two pieces in place and we have a program that's outlined and we feel like it's kind of ready to go, we're going to, some of the next steps, and these aren't necessarily in any particular order, but we're going to need to work with our internal folks from IT and the billing systems to make sure that we've got all of those internal systems in place that will allow for a good customer experience. We plan to have some stakeholder meetings to talk through the program and what our plan is in that regard. And then the final step will be actually filing the program with a tariff filing. So that's kind of a quick update on RNG and offset. I'll pause there for just a minute to see if there's any questions before we move on to hydrogen.
Yeah. Will the IRP have more of a concrete timeline?
Yes, and in fact, I'm trying to think as far as filing dates for the IRP. Some of this may happen before the IRP actually gets filed. We'll have to see on timing, but we're anticipating getting something put together relatively soon.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So just wanted to put a few slides in here to talk about the state of hydrogen. This is a really big topic. RNG and hydrogen are going to be critical in meeting the dual goals of decarbonizing our energy pipelines while also maintaining the benefits of reliability and resiliency that are currently provided by our distribution system. And in the same way that wind and solar and hydro resources are helping to decarbonize the electric distribution system, RNG and hydrogen are going to be really important in allowing us to decarbonize our pipeline system. And there's so much research and development that's currently underway and then ready to kick off in the hydrogen space that we could talk about this topic all day, but nobody wants to do that. So I'm going to provide you a really high level overview. If you want to dig a little bit deeper into any of these topics that I talk about, I've provided some links in the slides that will, take you to the source information. I'm happy to answer questions today. And then also if you have questions as you have a chance to kind of think about it a little bit more, we're happy to answer those after the meeting too. So on a federal level, this has been touched on a couple of times by other presenters, but the Department of Energy has launched the hydrogen shot. And it has a 1-1-1 goal. And that goal is to reduce the cost of clean hydrogen by 80% to $1 per kilogram in the next 1 decade. So I guess just to give you a little perspective, the current cost of hydrogen, according to DOE, is about $5 per kilogram. So reducing that cost by about a fifth, which will make hydrogen more competitive with other resources, fossil natural gas, and then RNG. The first piece of this hydrogen shot, or the first kind of action item, is hydrogen hubs. And the DOE has released a notice of intent to fund the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law's $8 billion program to set up hydrogen hubs. The idea is to develop, I've heard, I don't think there's a firm number on how many of them there will be. I've heard anywhere from 8 to 12, and those hubs will be located across the country. And the idea behind them is each one of them will include production, processing, delivery, storage, and end use of hydrogen, all within an integrated system. And that's going to help us be able to figure out how to use hydrogen at scale, work through some of the issues and some of the challenges before it's deployed on a larger scale. But these should be super helpful in helping us get hydrogen to the state where it's a really competitive fuel source. And we're expecting that funding opportunity announcement in September, October of this year. So these hydrogen hubs are going to become a reality in the very near future. And I think that's really exciting for all of us in the energy industry to see that happen. So that kind of outlines the federal level. If you want to go to the next slide. I also wanted to touch on hydrogen research that's being done by industry. So the sister company for Cascade, Intermountain Gas, which is a local distribution company in Idaho, has for a long time been a member of the Gas Technology Institute. And that's a research organization that's made up of member companies. And Intermountain has long been a member. There's 2 main sub-organizations under the Gas Technology Institute. One looks at research related to the operation of pipeline systems, and the other looks at research on end-use equipment, and particularly focused on energy efficiency and trying to develop products for that market, but also more recently, hydrogen has become a big focus. I sit on the board of directors for the end use arm of GTI, and it's really been interesting for me to see over the last couple of years how much and how quickly hydrogen research has ramped up. And so today I'm going to share with you some publicly available information, but I just wanted you to know that this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to all of the research that's in process. And there's a lot of crazy ideas and stuff that is in the research phase that's not public yet, but there's a lot going on in this space. So one thing that is exciting that has happened is the Gas Technology Institute and the Electric Power Research Institute have combined forces to create a collaborative called the Low Carbon Resources Initiative. It's a 5-year collaborative that's supported by both electric and gas utilities. And the goal of the collaborative is to advance the technologies that are needed for deep decarbonization within the next decade or so that they can be deployed in the 2030 to 2050 timeframe. So taking a look at alternative fuels and from all stages of the cycle, right? From production, transportation, storage, end use. A lot of work in the hydrogen space, looking at ammonia, all of the low carbon fuels that will be necessary to achieve deep decarbonization. And that's particularly exciting, I think, because it's industry wide. gas and electric utilities that are cooperating on this research. And so with all of that weight behind it, I think it will become very, it has the opportunity to be very successful, I guess. And then at the same time, the Gas Technology Institute has set up a hydrogen technology center, and they're doing a lot of gas industry specific research around hydrogen. This project is doing cross-cutting research from, again, along the entire spectrum. So product development, demonstration projects that are focused on clean hydrogen production, storage, delivery, and end use. And I thought it might be interesting to just to take a look at a couple of examples of some of the research that they're doing. If you follow the link that I've provided on this slide, it will give you really a good list of all of the research that really has some kind of a paper or a result that's come out already. Anything that's publicly available is on that site. So that'd be a really interesting place if you want to learn more about what GTI is doing in this hydrogen space. You can spend a lot of time reading on that site. So on the next slide, I've just put in a couple of examples. Like I said, there's a bunch there, but a couple of examples that we can walk through. On that next slide, oh, there we go. So the first is hydrogen at scale in Texas. And this is a joint venture between the Department of Energy, GTI, Frontier Energy, and the University of Texas. And they're looking into, or they're actually in the process of designing, building, and operating one of the largest collections of renewable hydrogen production and end-use technologies ever assembled at one site. And this is a prototype, really, of the hydrogen hubs that we're going to start seeing deployed by Department of Energy. But this gives a kind of a framework, and they're doing some initial testing on what those hydrogen hubs might look like. It really paves the way for the eventual build out of those hubs by demonstrating their use in an integrated system. And some of the end use demonstrations are going to include power generation, passenger vehicle fuels, marine fuels, and then I think they're also looking at like end use residential and commercial applications as well. So that will be interesting, especially again as we see those other hydrogen hubs start to develop. They're going to be using a lot of the research that's coming out of this Texas project as they're developing those other projects. And then the second one I think is particularly applicable with the conversations that we're having today. This was this assessing H2 compatibility in natural gas infrastructure. This was a study that GTI did on the detailed consequences of mixing hydrogen with natural gas throughout the North American natural gas distribution system. And that's really important, as the discussion pointed out earlier this morning, for maintaining a safe, reliable network. So GTI is looking at assessing the corrosion and hydrogen embrittlement mechanisms that are associated with blending hydrogen, looking at the impact of hydrogen blends on end use equipment. So part of this project, GTI completed an in-depth analysis of some of the key issues related to blending hydrogen into the natural gas pipeline system. And this analysis, and you can get to the analysis from this GTI Energy link. I can also drop out one of the white papers that came out of it into the chat that I think might be interesting for everyone. But it really provides the framework for the issues that GTI and others then are they've taken from that white paper to do additional research on for what we're going to need to know to be able to safely and reliably blend hydrogen. Some of the key takeaways I think that are applicable to some of the questions that came up this morning. 20% or less blends of hydrogen result in minor risk increase for pipeline systems. over 50% hydrogen blend results in more significant increase in risks. And then as a result of this white paper, GTI has also done some testing on the impacts of 0 to 30% hydrogen blends on end-use equipment. And the results are really promising for the ability to be able to blend 30% with little impact to end-use equipment. And then GTI is doing important work in assessing the impact of these hydrogen blends on pipeline materials and systems. Important area of focus in that is what levels of blending require no change to the existing system, what level would require us to do some retrofitting of the system. And then another key initiative they're working on is research necessary to develop hydrogen monitoring systems. We mentioned that a little bit. It's a smaller molecule, so the monitoring systems need to be different. I've also heard of some work being done by private companies to develop coatings that can be applied to existing pipeline infrastructure to allow higher levels, even up to 100% hydrogen transportation. That's a really exciting field of research because it would allow us to use our existing distribution system as is and run a coating on the outside or inside of the pipelines. I guess finally, the kind of final area is looking at monitoring systems and upgrades that might be required to the end use equipment. If we were to go beyond that 30% hydrogen blend, how does that impact end use equipment? So they're doing research in that regard as well. It looked like there's a question, but I've got to get the chat back up. So I think this GTI study that I mentioned, or the analysis that they did, took a look at all of the hydrogen blending projects that are happening really across the world. And I think that they, as I recall from reading that study, they took a look at what's happening in Europe, Australia, Canada's done quite a bit of research also. And then there's quite a few utilities across North America that are looking at some sort of blending. I think Canada's a little further ahead than we are. So Fortis and just lost the name of the other Canadian utility, Enbridge, are both looking at in the very near term and possibly already some demonstration projects around hydrogen blending. So this study kind of collected all of that and tried to put it in one place. So it's a really nice kind of level set for where we're at as an industry. And then it really sets the stage for being able to focus on the research that needs to be done to get us to the next level of utility scale hydrogen blending, and then at higher and higher levels. Did that answer your question, Abe?
Yes, thank you.
Lori, we also had a member of Cascade, Alan Spector, who traveled to Denmark recently and did some tours of hydrogen projects and stuff like that. And we plan to put some of Alan's findings on that into our IRP narrative when we file. So we have that as well.
Yeah, and that was a really fascinating trip, and the information that Alan brought back has been really interesting as we've been exploring this further.
Yeah.
So I'll drop that link in the chat. But again, if you've got further questions, happy to answer those now or later.
I see Dan Kirshner, you have a question?
Not really a question, just maybe a comment in addition to the research that's being done that Lori did a great job of reviewing, and the trip to Denmark and stuff like that. There are technologies being developed right here in the Northwest, in fact, right straight in Washington State. I was just in Richland, Washington on Monday and had an opportunity to see a new hydrogen generating appliance. It uses pyrolysis, not electrolysis. They have just completed their prototype, which they're shipping down to Southern California to work with it'll be installed in Sunline Transit's facility, it produces enough hydrogen in a day to fuel 3 transit buses. This is the prototype. The prototype actually sits right on a gas pipeline, so the feedstock for the hydrogen is natural gas, and it produces, through the prototype, as expensive as it is, the gas that the hydrogen that it can produce is about $8 a kilogram, which is about half what the commercial cost of hydrogen is for hydrogen vehicles in California right now, even as the prototype. So very exciting, based in Richland, a group of technologists that came out of PNNL down there. Another company is one in Bothell, Washington, called Modern Electron. So that the Richland one is called STARS Technology. You can look them up at starsh2.com. The other one is Modern Electron, which is developing an appliance that will actually sit either before or after your meter and will strip the carbon out of the natural gas. Again, the feedstock is natural gas. Strip the carbon out of natural gas and it becomes a solid, the carbon solid, graphene. And so what you're actually going to be burning in the appliance is hydrogen. So now there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But that's a very exciting technology that's right on the cusp. That company's funded by Bill Gates, among others. And again, Modern Electron, based in Bothell, Washington. So lots of really exciting research on the hydrogen front and other areas. Just thought, right in Washington State. So just thought I'd add that little bit of color.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's really good information. Are there any other questions before we move on to our RNG development status? All right, we'll send it off to Kent.
Thank you, Brian. My camera's not working well today, and I can't see if I'm actually showing up or not, but if I'm standing on my head or anything, please let me know. If it's annoying, I can turn it off. My role for Cascade is really at ground level development of RNG projects in Cascades, Oregon, and Washington service territories. I'm going to tell you very briefly about a few of the projects, the on-system projects that we're working on currently. Before I get far into this, I want to try and avoid confusion. Devin referenced his purchase versus build model earlier, and from the perspective I'm going to be presenting from, both of those options are a variation of what we'll be calling an attribute purchase project. One in which we own the entire plant and production operation, and a more typical approach for us would be to be working on an attribute purchase with a developer or directly with a customer who is owning their own plant and processing facilities that would connect at our interconnect facility. So we have a little bit of both, but I wanted to clarify that. I'm also going to be talking about transportation RNG projects, because on some projects we simply can't buy the environmental attributes. I'll talk about that more in just a second. Our first priority is on-system RNG development with an attribute purchase. We want to have the attributes to be able to use for our voluntary RNG tariff and for CCA compliance. So it is always the priority to make a purchase where we can. We currently have 4 projects that are in active contract negotiations that are purchase projects, and we've got one other municipal project that's in early development. On the transportation side, we have one project that's under contract and another project in active contract negotiation that the developer is targeting to get contracts completed by Labor Day, which may or may not happen. But we're getting closer, and we have 5 other projects in early development. And I want to mention a little bit more about this because we're going to run into this as more and more in different ways as we continue to develop these projects. When we can't buy the attributes, it's generally, there's a number of reasons, but 3 like real world examples are sometimes a project comes in with a developer where the waste owner already has an agreement in place. Someone is already purchasing those attributes. They've gone to them in advance and the whole project has been built around that. And then they may be coming to us. And it's typically at a project that's not prudent for us, or we don't even have an opportunity to discuss purchasing really. So another case is dairy is a very good example. If you have a D3 RIN gas that is very high in or very low in carbon intensity, that gas typically from dairies is bound for the California LCFS market where it's much more highly valued. The developers are looking for $60 to $70 an MMBTU in a lot of cases, which is far beyond really what's prudent for us to be buying. One of the things that we do that we're doing here with these is just helping these projects get on the system, and they displace the geological gas on our system. For all of that we're bringing on is essentially displacing the physical gas itself, still coming onto our system, and it's displacing geological gas on the Cascade distribution system. Go ahead, Brian. I'm going to go through these. There's a bit of repetition here, but I want to say to there's confidentiality attached to a number of these projects. The only one that we really are going to get real specific about, you've already heard about the Deschutes County landfill in Bend, Oregon. The rest of these are more have more confidentiality around them. I've listed counties rather than cities to give you an idea of the breadth and distance of the projects we're working on. Without getting too specific, but I'd like to tell you more about the sources so you get a bigger picture of what we're working on. But the Deschutes County landfill you've heard quite a bit about today already. That was an RFP process between Cascade and the Jacobs engineering team. That's the Jacobs engineering team works with MDU resources at the Billings landfill, and we've been operating a plant with them for 10 years there successfully. And this RNG we'll be building the entire plant. This is a build project as Devin defined, and we will be operating that plant for them. Fuel will be injected into the local Bend distribution system. It's a county landfill, but it sits right on the edge of the city of Bend, and it will be going into Cascade's Bend distribution system. We're currently working through the contractual details and some landfill operational changes to try to maximize gas production at that facility. Volumes are projected at 2.5 million therms a year, and right now we're looking at a 20-year agreement. It's still a negotiation. Another project that I'd like to mention is there's a project in Benton County. This is a combined project, I guess a small aggregation between a municipal landfill and a food producer there. The 2 streams are going to be combined into a single interconnect facility and brought onto Cascade's distribution system there in Benton County. This is a 1.25 million therms a year, 15-year agreement currently. Go ahead, Brian. We're also working on a municipal industrial food wastewater project. It's an aggregated facility, a municipally owned facility that processes industrial wastewater, but the wastewater itself comes from food growers, a combination of food growers, producers, and manufacturers. And it's all brought into one processing facility, and they had an RFP that's been awarded to a developer, and we've been involved in that process and are working right now negotiating purchase and interconnect agreements on that. It's a competitive project. The RNG, we would inject this into our high pressure system in the area, and it would end up being brought into a low pressure distribution system. The volumes are looking at about 3.4 million therms a year. It will be at least a 15-year contract as it stands now, possibly 20 years. This next project is in Yakima County. This is a project that we developed directly with the customer from the start. It was a partnership that has gone on. It's utilizing food waste and from an existing digester that has been flaring for years. We're to the point we are in purchase and interconnect agreement. Contract negotiations are going on now, and this will also be injected into the local distribution system there in the area. 715,000 therms a year. It's a 10-year agreement that we would hope to renew. And the next two projects.
So, I have a question.
Sure.
So a lot of these seem to be dealing with food waste, and I guess my question is, are the people who are dumping the food or supplying the food waste to these facilities, are they being paid for the waste, or do they pay effectively a fee in order to give the waste? What's the nature of that relationship?
They are being paid for the waste.
Okay.
It's in the form of what they're paid for the environmental attributes. So most of them, I'm trying to think if I can say, some of them have existing digesters in place and have been flaring. Some do not. Some are open air. So they're in various different forms, but they're being developed. And these are typically D5 RINs, going back to the RINs again. So they're in a price range that's more suitable for utility, and they're more willing to work with us on those kinds of arrangements. So the food waste aggregation and food waste, industrial wastewater aggregation are both good areas for us to work in.
I think maybe I just want to make sure I might have phrased that wrongly. So for example, when we're looking here at the Yakima County project, and it says food waste from an industrial food processor. Is the industrial food processor, are they doing all this internally to themselves and then contracting with you guys? Or is there another company that's doing the digestion or something on the side?
In this case, we have done it. I'm going to talk about this one in particular. They have to collect that waste now and handle it, which they're doing, but the system doesn't work well, and none of that energy is being utilized. So they're putting in a gas scrubbing system. It's already been in design. We've been a part of this from the beginning, and we'll be building an interconnect facility and the pipeline to it. But they're actually paying for the scrubbers and most of those systems on their own, and we're co-developing it together. Is that explaining
right,
the question?
Yeah, I mean, so like what I'm trying to wrap my head around is like there's a lot of different like ways that people are doing this. And I'm wondering if any of this might be inadvertently like incentivizing food waste, if that makes sense.
Oh, no. These are all existing. What's going on with all this food waste right now is that it's essentially either directing methane directly into the environment,
right,
or it's being flared off. So I mean, they're not increasing their output of food waste. They don't, they don't want to have to do this necessarily. But they've been handling it, and they're looking for a way to be more efficient with it. We're basically taking what is currently waste, or energy that's completely unutilized, and putting it into use.
Right. So I guess like if we go to the next one for the National Food Waste Aggregator, so where it says that there have like 100 grocery stores. Are they paying the grocery stores for the food waste, or the grocery stores paying to drop off the food waste there? I guess is what I'm trying to get at. It's like what's the dynamic there?
That you're getting into, in this case, your question is getting more into the waste aggregators business themselves. But my understanding of that is they actually they're a company that is hired to handle the waste for the grocery stores. They've aggregated this into a common facility so that they are doing the transportation of that waste, is my understanding, and it's brought into a common facility. These these two projects listed on this sheet are both transportation projects, and the National Food Waste Aggregator in Cowlitz County is this one is actually under contract and will be moving towards construction and or initial engineering design in about 6 weeks. This is kind of a different project because they came in with this waste already in place. They already had these agreements and they were looking to find a way to utilize it in a more productive way. And they had not had, they weren't getting the kind of response they wanted from a couple of other Northwest utilities and asked us, you know, if we could get involved with it. And we actually worked to site this with them. It was kind of an unusual and a nice opportunity because it's ideal to try to find something where you've got a customer like this who will work with you to site something in a place where you can onboard all the gas and it's helpful for them. I had some locations immediately in mind and some areas, and we kind of worked on sites that would give them good access to I-5, you know, for their transportation as well. So that one is 1.8 million therms a year. We may see gas flow late 2023. That's their plan, but we'll see. I think with lead times that we're seeing in some of the scrubber equipment, compressors, and even on the electrical, some of the electrical service equipment right now, we're getting 50-week lead times. I'm hearing from some of the developers. So I think we'll probably be looking more towards the beginning of 2024, as Abby kind of alluded to earlier in the presentation. The last one I'll talk about here is a large dairy project in Snohomish County. This is a transportation project. The interconnect agreement is in negotiation, and we're hoping to get that. That's one I was mentioning, that their goal right now is to have this executed before Labor Day, if possible. So we'll see if that happens. All of these projects I mentioned that are in contract negotiations they're not done deals. We're actively negotiating, but they're very advanced projects. Like I said earlier, we have several others that I mentioned that are in early to mid development. So that project in Snohomish County is they also have an intention of being online by late 2023. I think that's highly optimistic as well, but they are very very determined to get to that point. So go ahead, Brian.
We have a question in the chat. Are any of these projects here expected to be able to contribute RNG to reduce emissions in the first compliance periods, as mentioned by Abby earlier in the meeting?
Some of them, well, and Abby can correct me if I'm wrong here, but in the first, I guess because we got a 3-year aggregated compliance period, it would be within that first 3-year window. But I think she had them modeled as in 2024. That we talked about this yesterday, I believe, and I think she has them modeled in between Q2 and Q3 24. Is that right, Abby?
Yes. So depending on which program you're asking about too. So Oregon's compliance started this year already. So 22 to 2024 is the first compliance period for Oregon. It's 3-year. We're thinking that it's possible that there might be some in late late 2024 that could be utilized for some compliance there. But okay, I appreciate you asking that, Abdullah or Abe. And then Washington, of course, that doesn't start until next year. So then, you know, we'll be looking out further. But yes, so there could be. And then for other RNG opportunities for Oregon, because that compliance period ends in 2024, we'd probably be looking at purchasing environmental attributes and through our gas supply system. So just a little bit more detail there. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby.
Yeah, and just a bit more insight. Some of these digesters, I know it takes 2 years for them to build them. I know some of the ones I've been involved on in Idaho, at least for dairy waste, 2 years just to develop the digesters.
That's not the case for the one in Snohomish, based on what the developers has been telling us. I mean, I've been in the meetings with them, and they are committing to the deadlines that the developer's saying 12 months out. But we'll see if that happens. You may be right. We'll see. I just wanted to add one more point here, because we are, I sometimes hear the comment made that, you know, RNG is too small. It can't make a big enough difference. But I just wanted to point out of 4 of the projects listed here, the ones in Franklin, Yakima, Snohomish County in Washington, and in Deschutes County in Oregon, all of those projects are sufficiently significant enough in size to offset near 100% of the geological gas during the times of lowest system demand, which is kind of a key design point when you're trying to develop RNG projects. So I mean, and these are single projects, and that's fairly significant. And in 2 of these cases, these are decent sized secondary cities. So single RNG projects can make a difference. And as we get more of these, I think it'll become more clear that that RNG can make a difference, a sizable difference in our compliance and decarbonization. That's really all I had. This was brief, but I'd be glad to answer more questions if I can, if there are any.
Yeah, are there any questions for any of the presenters on RNG? If not, it is noon. I'm thinking it's best we'll take an hour lunch break. We'll come back at 1 o'clock and we will go into DSM forecasts, some preliminary results, and then we'll have a presentation from our engineering group on distribution system planning. So we'll see everybody at 1 o'clock.
Sounds good. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.